Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope that first breakout session was enlightening, inspiring, and that you're all ready to be engaged with our next panel. Balancing neighborhood improvements and neighbor preservation. This panel will feature a focus on the topic of gentrification. There's no doubt that a paradox exists when we talk about gentrification. On the one hand, it can desegregate neighborhoods, but it also can perpetuate segregation. Our goal with this panel discussion is to explore ways in which neighborhood improvements and neighborhood stabilization can coexist. This panel will be moderated by Ms. Angela McIver, CEO of the Fair Housing Rights Center of Southeastern Pennsylvania. Ms. McIver is a national leader and advocates for fair housing for all. She joined the Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania as Chief Executive Officer in 2007. If you go to your program booklet, you will see an impressive and extensive bio for Ms. McIver, but she asked that I not read it off. Our panel discussion, or panelists rather, will include the Honorable Curtis Jones Jr., a noted expert on community-based economic development. Jones Jr. has served in various public and private sector positions for more than 2 decades. Jones Jr. led the charge to enforce new public safety regulations for fire escapes, create the Philadelphia Mortgage Diversion Program, which prevented thousands of residents from losing their homes, along with a second moratorium on sheriff sales during January 2011 to further protect, preserve, and defend the homes of Philadelphians, and the Philadelphia Internship Tax Credit, which will allow high school, college, and vocational students in Philadelphia to receive a stipend for their work. Another panelist for today's discussion is Ms. Arlene Waynes, President and founder of Reliance Realty, LLC, a Pennsylvania minority owner and operated full-service real estate firm serving Philadelphia and eastern Montgomery counties. Arlene Waynes is an accomplished real estate, social service, and healthcare executive who has served in various capacities: broker and owner of real estate, instructor and trainer, executive director for a multi-dimensional elder healthcare facility, and successfully managing director of HUD-funded programs and services for low and moderate income families and senior service provider in the Philadelphia area. And we have our esteemed executive, Chad Dion Lassiter, executive director, who will be our third panelist. Mr. Lassiter is a national expert in the field of American race relations. He is the current executive director of the PHRC, where over his 4 years in this position, he has continued to push the Commonwealth forward in the spaces of DEI training, unconscious bias training, anti-racism training, and has developed and launched a No Hate in Our State town hall to address the surge of white nationalism in Pennsylvania, a social justice lecture series providing an outlet for the communities in the state to discuss imperative issues, and serves as a racial reduction response team for those communities impacted by hatred. So once again, I'm going to ask that we all welcome the panelists and our moderator, Ms. Angela McIver. Thank you so much. Testing.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today and be able to share this time and space to talk about our conversation at hand, which is balancing neighborhood improvements and neighborhood preservation, and we all know we're talking about gentrification. My name is Angela McIver, and as was mentioned earlier, I serve as the Chief Executive Officer of the Fair Housing Rights Center in southeastern Pennsylvania. Our mission is to ensure equal access to housing opportunities for all people, and we do so by working out of 14 counties. Our base is here in Philadelphia, and it's my honor and privilege this morning to be joined by this esteemed panel of speakers that are experts in various ways. You heard it through their bios. So we're going to start off by checking in right now. Can you all just share with me two things? Let's start with a word that describes your mood, and second, what motivates you. So if we can begin to my right.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And in terms of my mood, I feel the urge to always advocate and be effective in my community. So that drives me and drives my work and the things that I set out to accomplish.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you really hear me? Tessie. Thank you. Good morning, or good afternoon. Where are we at? Morning.
Still morning.
All right. If I were to describe where my mood is, it's always intense. And that intensity means that everything we do as elected officials, every decision we make, at the end of it is a person. And at the end of it is an impact. And that we have to be intentional in that purpose so that it actually benefits the people that elect us.
Thank you.
I'm appreciative, Angela, of you wanting to check in. You just bring so much, talent and expertise, specifically around trauma-informed care and making sure that we're not triggered. My mood at this very moment is phenomenal. I'm just excited about all that I'm learning. I'm emotional also because I'm on the stage with you, and you've been a dear colleague and friend since I've been at the PHRC. And then I've known Commissioner Councilman Jones for 20 plus years. And so he's an integral part of my village, and then so is Miss Arlene. So I'm feeling phenomenal. And then one word for me that drives me is, just a sense of justice, pursuing justice for all people on all sides of the color line and gender line as people express themselves.
Wow, that's awesome. So that's a really good way of mixing up what's going on inside of you and what motivates you to do the work that you do. So of course, Councilman Jones, this conversation is going to begin with the work that you do as a legislator. We talked previously and said that, your work in some ways is like that of a parent running a household. You have several children in the household. All children have needs, but sometimes one child's needs outweigh the others. So for example, if everybody gets new shoes in May, but by August, a child had a growth spurt, and now their shoes are 2 sizes smaller than they were in May, that child's need for shoes outweighs the other children. Is it fair to say that legislating is similar to running a household and looking at the needs of who's in the community and who needs what at any given time?
So you have to be somewhat schizophrenic to be a parent. And what do I mean by that? I have in the 4th Councilmanic District, which is West Philly, I go from Andorra, East Falls, Roxborough, Overbrook Farms, West Philly, Carroll Park, Haddington, all the way down to Market Street. So to give you context, I have several $1-million homes, and I have homes that have a negative net worth, meaning it would cost more to tear them down than they are ever going to be worth. So to balance that, to balance the children's needs, you have a right of people who want to experience the free market, to invest, to develop, to improve neighborhoods. And they have a right to do that. This is a capitalistic society, market-driven society. But you also have children that, for sometimes no fault of their own, find themselves impoverished, find themselves discriminated against, find themselves gentrification targets, find themselves in a neighborhood that has been redlined, in a neighborhood that is impoverished, that where if you walk out the door, what do you have a greater chance of running into? A book, a vegetable, or a gun? And in a lot of cases, it is the gun. There's parts of my neighborhood where the low property values are. Every 28 days, someone is going to be shot. They live in public housing often. They live in conditions that are captive. And so you have to balance the rights of the people who have means with the rights of the people and needs of the people who do not have them.
Indeed. So picking up where he left off, Miss Arlene, and I go back and forth between Arlene and Miss Arlene because I have so much respect for this woman. Your work would be to sell homes in those areas, or to serve as the broker in those areas. How does legislating in those areas and the different needs that people have show up in your work?
Well, how legislative issues show up in our work is that we see people being denied access to housing, and we see people being denied mortgages and denied loans to improve their community, to improve their homes. This is very difficult for us at times because we are constantly struggling to overcome the barriers of systemic racism in this community, and it's very difficult for those people that we come in contact with because they are usually traumatized by the fact that they cannot move from the places that they are in. And it's not always in Philadelphia, we have a high poverty rate, as we know, but we also have a middle class and we have an upper class, as mentioned. And we see difference in different stages, but I can say this in terms of the people that we serve, particularly people of Black and Brown, they all are facing some difficulties in overcoming the barriers to home ownership or to improving their life standards.
And of course, Executive Director Lassiter, you're just going to pick up where the two just left off. You're seeing this show up in your office in terms of complaints. And I know that PHRC has been very vocal in recent years about the need to affirmatively further fair housing, because when Ms. Arlene mentioned systemic barriers, I know that you've been trying to raise this issue at the Pennsylvania Department of Community Economic Development and in other spaces in our Commonwealth to help them understand that they have a role to play in actively removing these systemic barriers, or if it's on a case-by-case basis that people come to your office. Can you enlighten us right now with examples or information that we need to know about when we're trying to strike this balance and preserve communities, what your office doing or seeing?
So the racial elephant that currently should be in all rooms of those who are in the housing space is what the Philadelphia Sixers are proposing as it relates to the stadium being placed in Chinatown against the backdrop of how communities are gentrified in the city of Philadelphia. And communities existed before these entities moved into the city of Philadelphia. The University of Penn does not exist in and of itself. The University of Penn is a guest in the neighborhood of West Philadelphia, or what was known historically as the Black Bottom. LaSalle University is a guest. Some years ago, the president of Temple University, those of us who grew up in Philadelphia, we know it to be Cecil B. Moore. We know what that community is. And at some point during his leadership, he wanted Temple to be known as Templetown. Temple and that particular catchment area has gentrified that entire area at the expense of people who lived in and out of lived in that community, grew up in that community, work in that community, have mores and values, were socialized and oftentimes racialized in North Philadelphia. For those of us who grew up in that area, went to the Uptown Theater, so forth and so on. So at the present time, one of the initiatives that we've embarked upon under our Director of Enforcement and some of the leadership in the Philadelphia Regional Office is just that. What role is the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission going to play under the PHRA as it relates to the proposed creation of the stadium? And what does that look like? All of those elements that are within fair housing and property taxes and, community block grants, agreements and things of that nature. And so it's very important for us to recognize also that we can't be in a space, I don't fundamentally believe, where we're like, okay, on one end, this is good for the city because we grew up, it was the gallery. Others know it as being the fashion district that's actually getting ready to be shuttered. It's getting ready to be shuttered in the sense that it's getting ready to file for bankruptcy. So it's going to be closed at some point. And I'm not here in my role at PHRC or as a citizen of Philadelphia to simply say either or. I think once again, and hopefully this conversation that we're having on gentrification really gets into the nuances of both and that there are some benefits, but it's how you savage and ravage communities, how you displace communities, how oftentimes our universities are lockstep in with big developers. And, they're on the take on a lot of levels where we're going to do this at all costs. And so we don't care about communities. We don't care about people who existed here. And that also feeds the systemic and structural issues around the violence. I know you didn't ask that, but it's like,
this is good.
Yeah, in and around Temple University and in and around University of Penn, when students are in these communities, Poughton Village, that's West Philadelphia. Mantua, that's West Philadelphia, adjacent to the zoo. We throw these little chic names out, and there are people who have been marginalized, oppressed, rendered non-person, non-entity that oftentimes will look at these students and shouldn't attack them, but then the students live in these communities, and then when they check out for the summer, the communities are just torn apart, with them not even having a certain moral compass or moral imperative to put their things away. So I can't speak about individual cases, but I can tell you that our commissioner is aware of some of the things that we're proposing with Director Young and others to really look at this, to really look at what it would mean if, in fact, the stadium displaces a population. And then lastly, we have data. We have data of what happened in Washington, in the Chinatown community there. Community benefits agreement, and they said, oh yeah, we partner with the Asian American Pacific Islander community, but if you go in that catchment area, you may have Starbucks that has the appropriate language for AAPI, but you have no AAPI people running the Starbucks.
Yeah, absolutely so. And I'm glad you went there because underlying all of this, in my head, is the idea that we're talking about Philadelphia and we're really talking about areas that were redlined to begin with. So let's step back and deal with the fact that the people who we're trying to preserve, the neighbors that we're trying to preserve, are folks that, for the most part, escaped the brutality and the harsh conditions of the South, came north during the first and second phases of the Great Migration. And we know that there were Black folks here long before then, but a whole lot came during the Great Migration and were relegated into red line communities. And what's interesting about a red line community and a red line map when you look at it is you're getting a clear message. The red stands for what? Dangerous, risky, or hazardous. And I've always believed that that didn't just describe the conditions, but it was also a signal about the people who were going into those conditions. So what do we do about the fact that these are areas where there's been historic disinvestment to begin with? And if you're getting the signal that an area is dangerous, risky, and it is hazardous, who in their right mind would want to invest in those areas? Unless you come in to gut it and then replace who's there and the infrastructure and so forth. So, Councilman, it looks like you want to respond to that, by all means.
So if you ever followed the series The Wire, There's episodes or a series of them, New Amsterdam. And what it chronicled was how systematically you allow a condition to persist in a community so that property values are suppressed, so that investors can come in and buy cheap and then turn off the spigot of crime and begin to appreciate the value of an area. So you may say truth is stranger than fiction, in the sense that all you got to do is look at Kensington, where a condition of chronic poverty, drug addiction is allowed to persist, and those bedroom communities in and around there are being purchased, pennies on a dollar, for the time that the great migration of new neighbors comes in to clean it up. In my case, in my district, that market force that I talked about is true with the Penn Win example. Penn Win was one of those buildings that came under HUD contract. That HUD contract expired, and investors said, you're right outside your door, there's a train platform that I can get to Center City in 15 minutes for $2.50. You have the park 1 block up, City Avenue 5 blocks up. What a great place to live, work, and play. But those people that had gone through the bad times, the 80s and drug addiction, that were veterans, that were people with disabilities, that were people that were poor. They said, we want you out, even if you paid the rent on time. We want to go in a different direction. And so those investors put people out without just cause and just said, you have to go. And we don't want you renewed, goodbye. At that point, I realized gentrification was real for me. Before it was somebody else's problem. It was South Philly's problem. It was North Philly's problem. Wasn't my problem. But as these assets came online, developers wanting to make a buck decided to move in. And now, in my district, there's the Pavilion, there's Brith Shalom, there's these valuable properties that are coming to the end of their life cycle on these HUD agreements that are targets to remove hundreds of units out of my district to put market rate. So these are the things that I must begin to legislate and take into consideration.
And I can't help it, Ms. Arlene, this just seems like the perfect place for you to step in, because the councilman is correct. Where we had so many concentrated units that benefited from the low-income housing tax credit that are sunsetting, people are now facing these market rate rents that we know they can't afford. Now what? What can you possibly do for someone who's in that predicament?
Well, there's not very much we can do if we allow this to continue. Gentrification is just another form of redlining. And I look at it from my perspective, I'm looking at the individual. I can tell you the stories. I can tell you what's happening, people in their homes who are now being displaced. They don't know where they're going. They're trying to figure it out. And in my business, I see that there has to be legislation to stop this bleeding. When you have people coming into the neighborhood and say, well, we'll buy your house, wholesalers. Wholesaling in the state of Pennsylvania is illegal, but who is managing that? No one. You do not sell a home or purchase them with someone who's not licensed. So that person, that homeowner, is not receiving any consumer protection. They don't understand what they're signing, what they're doing. What I see, and I've had council persons call me for my experience or expertise about what's going on. This neighbor wants to determine if she sold her house or not. So I go to see them, look at the contract. Wholesaler has sold them or purchasing their home at a price they think they're going to get. And I'll just give you a number. Well, I'm purchasing your house and you for $150,000. And once they looked at the contract, and one neighbor wasn't smart enough to know, she says, well, I'm going to sell them at the day, but it says I'm only getting $80,000. I don't understand this. So they do these kinds of things. They're literally robbing these people. So what does that create? Creates trauma for the family. I'm walking into people's homes that are packed up because someone has come in and said, well, we're going to settlement in 30 days. And in our community, where we have poverty, where we have people looking for means and ways to just survive, when they receive an offer, they're anxious to take it, not knowing that they're really being robbed. In addition to those types of things, we see people who are perplexed about where do I go once you're renting, particularly with renters. So we need some legislation to say if you're renting and your landlord sells the property and now tells you have to, there should be a time frame. You cannot displace this person based on the fact that you no longer want to rent and you want to sell. We need to do things to protect the consumers, protect the citizens that have been living in these communities for years.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, by all means, applaud. There must be more action. There has to be. And I guess, Executive Director Lassiter, this is a great place for you to step in, because what can the commission do? I mean, we're always going to, I'm always going to probably lean in, but what can the commission do? What can the commission do, about the education, about, letting the folks who are contributing to the problem know that some of these acts are illegal. And even when it's not illegal, for me, the immoral and unethical acts are as problematic, because to me, gentrification is not just how a neighborhood changes. You have one economic group placing another. Now, all of a sudden, you see investments that you didn't see before. The price points have changed. Taxation is changed. It is also about tactics that people are using in the real estate industry, to undermine one group in order to benefit another. So with all of that said, what's PHRC have to say or doing about all of this?
So great question. Lots of things. Under the leadership of Director of Fair Housing Commercial Property, Director Garcia, and a plethora of individuals at PHRC, we first start with education and outreach. We have a television show on the Pennsylvania Cable Network called PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century, getting ready to go into our 5th year. We cover such topical areas as hoarding, redlining, gentrification, the trauma that people ensue because of fair housing violations. We talk about the Fair Housing Act. I think you've been on there, Angela. I think, Commissioner and Councilman Jones has been a guest. Several people have been guests. So that's one aspect of the educational aspect. And then we do, under the shared leadership model, back to basics with regards to understanding HUD, understanding all of the Fair Housing Act, understanding the 2 parts of the Fair Housing Act, the violations. We're in a lot of communities and have been for the past 2-3 years with regards to advocacy, with regards to education, with regards to informational data. Collaboration is also key. Partnering with your organization, partnering with the Urban League, partnering with, so many organizations around Pennsylvania. And then also something that a lot of civil rights and human rights organizations don't do, and I'm not trying to be judgmental here, we're well read. You have to be well read in the data. And not just because it's new with the color of law, but there are lots of books. Yes, she's holding some up. If you look in the booklet, we have some recommended readings as well. So we're well read on the current literature. We're also moving to produce data. That's what our white paper is. Our white paper is producing data. We're going to have a rollout. So a lot of work is done in all 3 regional offices. Then we're also aided at the PHRC from a historical standpoint with individuals who have done this work. Our regional director in the Pittsburgh regional office, Regional Director Lyle Wood, started out as a housing advocate in Pittsburgh with the Urban League of Pittsburgh. He's also done so many things to train the next generation. So once again, it's understanding what the Fair Housing Act is, understanding that it's the intersection with our Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and how we can hold people accountable. So I wouldn't say that we're essentially just hypothesizing, it's taking educated guesses on what we should do. We're doing the work in the housing space. And so when we talk about not just gentrification, it's not just simply DEI training. We're also saying let's have a conversation around anti-racism training for lenders, appraisers, gentrifiers, developers, realtors, and multiple others.
With that said, what do you recommend that the city of Philadelphia, I'm sorry, Councilman Jones, you're representing the, the council right now. So, it's not a personal thing, but more broadly, Executive Director Lassiter, if you could influence more legislation, because yes, the city of Philadelphia has done things like Just Cause, which is fantastic. That's a model effort, ensuring that, there's a reason why this eviction is going to take place, or even ensuring that people have representation. That's another model. I'm hearing them at the federal level talk about the need for doing that. But we know that there's so much more that needs to be done. So if there's something that you could recommend right now that the councilman could take back to his colleagues.
I'm listening.
Okay, there you go. You have the floor.
What I would do is, with my power, however that's defined, with my privilege, not getting rid of it, but utilizing it on behalf of humanity, is speak to people like you. Speak to people like Director Garcia. Great question, but I don't have an identity crisis. I would meet with you, I would meet with others who are well-versed in this space, who this is not an intellectual gymnastic exercise, it's your life's work. I would intersect that with my life's work for finding joy and transcending self to serve all humanity. And then I would say, yo, Angela, yo, Director Garcia, I got an audience with the governor. I have an audience with the White House. I have an audience with Councilman Jones and, Congressman Dwight Evans and Senator Bob Casey. What should we be asking them? And I'm not just going to show up with those questions. They're not going to be Socratic. I'm going to make sure that you're in the room more often than not. You're going to be there. Director Garcia is in the room, and then we're going to have those standardized questions with threads of uniformity prepared to ask him.
Councilman, does that sound like an idea?
I'm going to take an even step further back. You have no idea the impact this commission, we were in the lobby, and I said, every time I'm around you, I feel like I'm in class. Like I really take notes and want to know more. But you assume that elected officials have this knowledge base that it took you a lifetime to acquire. We rely on this commission, your expertise, to be able to translate that into useful legislation. So I'm blessed to have a group of elected officials, Kendra Brooks, Jamie Gutierrez, Isaiah Thomas, Kathy Gilmore Richardson, that are more, how shall I say, liberal than my predecessors were. Like, we were very conservative. We didn't understand the pandemic's impact, the uprising and social unrest impact on society. And literally, over my tenure, I've watched our council move a little to the left. So I thought it was trailblazing that we did an eviction mortgage foreclosure moratorium. They then translated that into an eviction moratorium during the height of the pandemic. They translated that to proper counsel for those people that are being evicted. They translated that into providing more housing counselors and budgets. So what you taught me, I didn't know about a disparate impact. That wasn't something that came in our manual, but I learned from you, translated it to my colleagues, which translates into public policy laws that help people. Said, every decision we make, there's a person at the end of it, and by receiving and exchanging the information that we have, it benefits the people. Example, didn't know until I met you that our CDBG budget had to have an affordable housing plan attached in order for us to get the $63 million the city gets annually. And so now I'm paying attention to that. Now I'm saying, well, wait a minute. What you're saying sounds good, but it has no real impact to save this whole level of people that require this kind of service. So this exchange, these kinds of workshops and town halls are the things that educate people who have the power to create laws in a way that benefits us all. So you underestimate your impact upon me and my impact upon my colleagues. And so I want to thank you all for that.
Thank you for that. Yes, that is certainly worthy of an applause. Ms. Arlene, the thing that I love about the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, and also known as NAREB, is that it all began with 10 men and 1 woman
Yes.
whose pursuit was democracy in housing.
That's
I mean,
correct.
democracy in housing, everybody. And you've never dropped that mantle. For 75 years, this is an anniversary, a big anniversary for NAREB this year, 75 years. So with the 75 years, you all perceive the Fair Housing Act. I say that you are the forerunners of the Fair Housing Act. Thank you so much. Whose purpose is anti-redlining. And you mentioned redlining earlier. And yeah, I see redlining, and we know it shows up in terms of the disparities in lending practices. We know people still being, steered to certain neighborhoods and certain other traditional things that involve typical redlining. But honestly, at this phase, I'm as concerned about sundowning going on in Philadelphia as I am about redlining. Because I believe that it's not going to be long unless we continue to do more and more and more, that you won't be able to stay in Philadelphia. You'll come here for business, entertainment, education, maybe some medical services, and then you're going to leave because you're not going to have a home here. What say you about that? What are you seeing around sundowning and the gentrification? Because if we're not making constant efforts to preserve neighborhoods of folks who were here a long time ago, what's going to happen to them?
Well, I think it begins with the current generation and passing that information on to the next generation. We, as a community and the families, we have to fight back. We have to begin to, as it's been talking today about neighbors, the neighbors. We need to come together. Communities need to come together. There are some communities that are fighting back, and some communities in North Philadelphia. Those of you who are native Philadelphians, you may have remembered our radio station, WHAT, Black-owned station. It was a Mary
Mason.
Mary
Mary
Mason.
Mason.
She said about 30 years ago on the radio every morning, she said to the folks in North Philadelphia, don't leave them your house. Stay in your homes. She said you need to hold on to this because she knew what was coming. And she tried to impart that information, but then we seen in North Philadelphia, you seen people like when Yorktown, and we know we had a lot of politicians that were the first to move into Yorktown. A totally different concept that we're staying in our neighborhood, in spite of Temple University being here trying to push us out. Okay, so there are communities that need to form a group and come together to push back and educate each other about this, because there are people now, developers and investors, what they're saying to us, if there's blood on the street, we invest. And that's a sad situation. And then there are others, we've heard, well, if there's a drug situation in the neighborhood, what are they doing about it? And when you bring in other type of drug problems into a community, so the neighbors, the people, I believe, need to come together and fight back. And I think that those who cannot, we need to support the senior citizens who are finding themselves locked into a situation that they cannot come out of without our help.
Wow.
And Angela,
Please, chime right in.
if I can just add to that, I think also for commissions like the PHRC and multiple other commissions, it's also moving ourselves forward to compete against the evils of racial segregation. What I mean by that is we need to have people who make up the workforce who have backgrounds in ethnography, sociology, anthropology, the social sciences, the humanities, city and urban planning. I think of Taj Schwartz, who's in our Philadelphia regional office, who has a master's in city planning from the University of Pennsylvania. I think that it's about understanding demographic shifts, understanding what urban centers are starting to look like. To your question with regards to sundown towns, not just in Philadelphia, but around our democracy, against the backdrop of white anger, white fear, white violence, white victimization, demographic shifts that are changing, dealing with generational trauma, 4 decades of Philadelphia being entrenched in the roles of poverty under all the mayors over the past 4 decades. Those of you who may know, may not know, Commissioner and Councilman Jones, before he was a councilman, was on the side fighting for economic justice with a lot of things, creating small business opportunities for minorities, women, and other that morphed into bringing people out of poverty to the middle class to making millionaires that gave back to their community. So I think, once again, it's how do we change? For instance, when I talk about the white paper, I don't want to underscore that. Research, right? The things that you do, we have to have qualitative, quantitative data that speaks to the redlining, right? We just can't say, oh, the redlining is happening, gentrification is happening. The impact that gentrification has on the emotional trauma of children against the backdrop of educational apartheid, environmental injustice, systemic and structural racism, those things are very important. So I just wanted to add that to the discourse because it ties into what Ms. Arlene talks about when she talks about fighting. You just can't fight in your regional office. You have to be able to fight in the streets, in the courts. You have to be able to fight also from a policy standpoint. And also the reality of our white paper being a white paper and turning that into a fair housing book. Because the book lives in perpetuity, and then you can have that book strategically placed in those universities where people want to speak back to the gentrification, a la University of Penn and multiple others.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for adding that, because I was going to come to you to talk about, your expertise in race and race relations. So I think you gave us a bit of that just then. Now, this is for everyone. Can you speak to the trauma? But I want you to broaden what you're typically thinking about trauma and now add in all people's trauma, Black trauma, white trauma, Latino trauma, Asian trauma. We got a lot of trauma. We have a lot of invisible wounds that people are dealing with, and I know that in all of your work, somehow, some way, you must address those invisible wounds. So can you articulate for us what you're thinking about that and what you're willing to do or what you have done to address the invisible wounds? Because the trauma's real. I devoted 1.5 years to understanding trauma, taking courses, and it related to previous academic work I had done around neuroscience, and learn it, really, it's all science. It's all about the science. And some books describe trauma as an electrical jolt that occurs inside of us. But then I had another person who described it in a way that I think is better than saying an electrical jolt, and that is the heart gasp. The heart gasp. So in your work, whether it's as a legislator, as a broker, realtor, advocate, your work leading the Commonwealth's civil rights organization, how do you deal when you're aware of these moments when the heart gasps?
So the most difficult part of my job is when a mother has to bury a son prematurely murdered due to gun violence. There are 2 sounds you never forget: a mother giving birth and a mother realizing death of their child. Scars you forever. So that post-trauma happens a lot, and people deal with, some of the best conversations were in the hallway, y'all. We were talking about some of this. But I was in a situation where there's an impacted area of North Philly. And in this very densely populated area, that if you come out on a block, you can look down the block and see the corner store. A block away was the person who took someone's life on the block. So they share that corner store. So that intense post-murder trauma happens, and it repicks the wound every time you go get milk and you see one of the people from the block where your son was murdered. I was visiting the family, and people deal with stress differently, deal with trauma, post-trauma differently. And there was a brother of the victim sitting at a table. He had a big gulp and he had a KFC 3-piece and a biscuit. And he was sitting there on his phone like nothing happened. Like his brother is about to be buried. And he was just eating his food. And the way that people process stuff, it's not the brother or sister that is on the couch screaming and crying that you better pay attention to. It is the kid that's saying nothing, that is processing in a different way. And remember this, hurt people hurt people. They take it out on other people. So to the whole issue of neighborhood and balancing development, there is an interesting concept called 57 blocks in Philadelphia, and it's done by a group called Power. And what they're talking about, there are 57 blocks where 11 or more shootings and sometimes murders have occurred. And if you study those 57 blocks, there's certain similarities: poverty, miseducation, housing, other traumas that happen. And that we have to treat those 57 blocks differently by investing education, investing post-traumatic stress counseling. And that if we do that, we will uplift that the community by reversing the ravages of what has happened historically. And we're really taking, some people want to do reparations, okay. This is something we can measure. This is something that will have a tangible impact and may result in solutions. So we're looking at that by way of housing and other things that we can do to invest in a community so that we can take them out of that 57 most dangerous blocks in Philly. So we're looking at post-traumatic stress as all of these things connect. They're not education. Wilson Good Sr. says that if you want to reduce crime, reduce dropout rates in your lowest performing schools by 50%, there'll be a corresponding reduction in crime. So we have to scientifically start to weigh and measure solutions.
So in other words, you're talking about trauma-informed legislation.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it looks like you want to say something.
I was just briefly going to say that I think your question is thought-provoking. That's really difficult for a number of us on this panel, including yourself, to answer in the moment, because we have to unpackage our trauma, or what Dr. Joy DeCrue Larry calls post-traumatic slave syndrome disorder, generational trauma. There is not a person that I grew up with in Philadelphia that cannot point to police brutality. My dad experienced police brutality at the hands of Frank Rizzo. My dad suffered post-traumatic stress disorder because he did, 2 tours in Vietnam. I'm living proof of being almost left for dead in North Philadelphia at the age of 15 at the expense of police brutality in the city of Philadelphia. The councilman has stories. You have stories, I know. I grew up with this under this woman's tutelage, so she knows. So we're called upon to lead these organizations, compartmentalize our pain, engage in a form of self-care, and act like the triggers don't bother us.
So true.
And if we're in the black body, it's what the great Jimmy Baldwin called to be black in America is to be in a constant state of rage. And the rage does not engulf itself onto white people. There's no such thing as a black Ku Klux Klan. There was never black people hanging white people from trees, but that's not an indictment against white people. So we have to compartmentalize our pain, and in our role at the PHRC, there's no form of ethnocentrism. We go hard to combat anti-Semitism. We go hard to combat Asian American Pacific Islander hate. We go hard for LGBTQ+. We go hard to make sure we address discrimination in public accommodations, commercial property, employment, education. But the black experience in this democracy is very unique. When Du Bois did the Philadelphia Negro, the first sociological study of its kind in the country, talking about black life in the 6th Ward off of Lombard Street. Bring it into the contemporary, the generational trauma. Young black males are not just killing because they decide to get up in his district and multiple other districts and say, let's just kill. There's an antecedent to that. There's a precursor to that. Not-binary forms of victimization, so it's all of those things. And at the height of George Floyd, it was you and I, if I may breach confidentiality, that was holding each other up on the phone, trying to keep a level of sanity about ourselves as we do this work.
I broke during a professional meeting. I couldn't help it. I broke. My humanity stepped forth, and I sobbed.
And we treat black grief differently than we treat other forms of grief. So once again, it would take us a longer opportunity to unpackage this, but I think one of the things that I'll end by saying is having a spiritual support system, visiting several houses of faith, engaging in a form of self-care, and finally at the age of 50, in a space where some will get me, some won't, so what?
Oh, well, right. And Ms. Wayne.
Drop the mic.
I'm almost here.
Having lived in Philadelphia, born and raised in Philadelphia, educated in Philadelphia, I studied urban planning and economics at Temple University in their graduate division for housing management. So I've learned everything about real estate, housing, and about social issues here in Philadelphia. I travel the city and visit all the areas to the far northeast, to other parts to see what was actually going on in our city. But I can tell you when I actually went into North Philadelphia and worked as a health director for seniors in the community to say, okay, what is the issue with housing and seniors? And the doctors, the black doctors got together and said, it's health. We don't have a healthy community. You're not gonna have a healthy home. If you don't have a healthy home, you don't have healthy children. And when you don't have healthy children, they don't want to learn. They don't want to do the things that you think that they should to survive. And this is what we're seeing. You don't have healthy children because they're not in healthy homes. And they are the ones that are on the streets causing the blood.
Oh, I agree with you. I agree with you on that. I totally do. Your housing is your health.
That's it.
Your health is your housing, and we know that it's playing a significant role in people's behavioral health.
Right.
And I'm aware that we are at the end of our time, but there's two things that we have to do. Director Garcia directed me to ask a final question, but before we get to that final question, there's one. Are we using everything in the tool chest? And if not, can you give me briefly, a synopsis of what can we use that we haven't used already in the tool chest? And if we are using it, are we using it effectively? So let's start with you.
Well, we talked about fair housing and that Fair Housing Act in 2015 that has not been really used and so on the shelf. We need to bring that out.
The
Definitely.
AFFA troll.
Yes.
The AFFA troll. Thank you. Yes, Councilman Jones.
So I've never experienced the federal, the state, the city working together to deal with housing issues. And yes, you're going to have opponents to it. Yes, you're going to have conservative elements. But at this point in time, we are uniquely situated to actually make a difference. So I'm encouraged.
Awesome. All three levels. And yes, Executive Director Lassiter.
We've added a director of policy and intergovernmental affairs for the second time. And this one really gets it with regards to the nexus of policy, pragmatism, practical implementation by using the PHRA and the Fair Housing Act. So I would say that our social justice toolkit, against the backdrop of us establishing our ambassador program, strengthening our advisory council, get ready because we are more than just being and becoming, but we about to take over.
Okay.
On behalf of the people of the Commonwealth.
Sounds like music to my ears. Now, this is it. This is the last question. Can you drop something that we can all walk away with? What are you all willing to impart upon us that you are willing to do as a result of attending this conference? And what can we do?
Well, I'm willing to share the information that I've learned today. I've got a lot of nuggets, and I think it's important to be able to use that in my tool chest to say that now I have information that may help someone through a difficult situation, whether it be eviction or home buying. I will use that. The most important thing is that we educate and elevate the people so they understand that there is some help and support.
Thank you.
So what I'm committed to do is to continue to be open to evolve. And when I first came on this commission, when I first met you, I was in a much different, more conservative space. And as I saw and listened and kept an open mind, I saw the value in what you were saying and the benefit to the people I'm serving. And I evolved, and now I share that with my new colleagues, because one-fourth of them are new, and so they don't always come with this wheelhouse of information that I have access to. So I will continue to be open-minded, I will continue to evolve, and I will continue to share.
Wonderful. You got the last word.
Just continue to listen, continue to learn, and the listening it's not just with my ears, it's with my spirit. Listen, learn, and then be prepared to lead, but not lead alone. I work with some amazing people at the PHRC, and I know some amazing people, who I can call at any particular point in time. So listen, learn, and then be prepared to lead in a shared leadership philosophy that brings about a beloved community in the housing space and all other spaces.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you all for what you do. And I want to give a hand to everybody in the audience. Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasure.
Listen, learn, and lead. I walk away with that, and I hope you all do too. Thank you so much for this excellent panel. Before we go, because unfortunately we have to end this conversation for right now, just when we were getting started, I know, because we have to stay on time, I want to present some awards. Not just for showmanship, but for true gratitude and true appreciation for boots on the ground. Miss Arlene Waynes Thomas. I would like to introduce or present this presentation to you for your participation in today's panel and for the work that you've been doing. Thank you so much. Commissioner and Councilman Curtis Jones, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And not least, but Miss Angela McIver, I would like to present to you 2 awards. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. But yes, 2 awards. This one is for your participation today and for your continued work and advocacy in this space. Thank you so much. And also Director Garcia.
Oh, my goodness.
This is the Fair Housing Partner of the Year Award, presented to the Southeast Fair Housing Rights Center CEO, Angela McIver. Thank you so very much for the work that you continue to do and your leadership.
Because I want to quit every day. I do.
Again, we know that well-needed conversation was sort of cut short abruptly, but I just wanted to plug that on July 20th, we will have a disability conference in Harrisburg, hosted by the PHRC. Please tune into our social media websites and other media outlets for that location. Now we're going to transition to our lunch, which is going to be held on the 5th floor. So you can take the elevator to the 5th floor ballroom for lunch. Thank you so much.